Chapter 1: The Scientist. I always thought espionage would feel like walking a tightrope, balanced between danger and revelation. Instead, it often feels like I'm walking through a fog, grasping at shapes that dissolve when I get too close. That's how it felt when I was assigned to interrogate Dr. Sergei Volkov. The briefing was held in a sterile, windowless room deep within Langley. I sat at the far end of a long table, surrounded by senior officers and analysts. A thick dossier sat in front of me, stamped with enough red ink to suggest I was holding something radioactive. Dr. Sergei Volkov, began Director Harland, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence, is a high-value defector, a physicist by training, but his real significance lies in his extracurricular work. Harland paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. What kind of work? I asked, flipping through the dossier. It was frustratingly vague. Dates, credentials, a few blurry photos of Volkov standing beside men in uniforms. None of it explained why the room felt so tense. Psychological experiments, Harlan said, his tone clipped. He was part of a Soviet program that tested the limits of human endurance, mental and physical. Details are sparse, but suffice it to say the methods were unconventional. What exactly are we talking about here? I pressed. Torture? Brainwashing? My mind jumped to MKUltra, the CIA's own brush with unthinkable psychological experiments. You don't need to know, Harlan snapped. And you don't want to know. Your job is to focus on his motivations and what intelligence he can offer. Stay on task, Agent Graham. We're not here to play amateur psychologist. The room went silent. I looked down at the photo clipped to the file. A gaunt, pale man with thinning hair and a distant gaze. He didn't look like a monster, but then again, monsters rarely do. Volkov was being held in a secure facility an hour outside D.C. When I entered the interrogation room, he was already seated, hands folded neatly on the metal table. The room was cold, lit by a single fluorescent bulb that cast harsh shadows across his face. He looked up as I walked in, his expression unreadable. Agent Graham, I presume? His English was impeccable, with only the faintest trace of an accent. He smiled faintly, as if we were meeting for tea rather than an interrogation. That's right, I said, taking a seat across from him. Dr. Volkov, welcome to the United States. I trust your accommodations have been satisfactory. His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Satisfactory enough, for a man in my position. There was something unsettling about him. His tone was polite, almost warm, but his gaze was clinical, like a scientist studying a specimen under glass. I'd met plenty of defectors before, some arrogant, others desperate, most nervous. Volkov was none of these. He radiated a calm that felt out of place, given the circumstances. I'm here to understand your reasons for defecting. I began, keeping my tone neutral. You've left behind a significant career, not to mention considerable risk to your own life. Why now? Volkov leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled under his chin. Do you know what it means to reach the edge of the map, Agent Graham? I frowned. The edge of the map? Yes, he said, his voice soft but firm. The place where knowledge ends and only darkness remains. That is where I have been working these past years. At the edge. And I defected because I could no longer bear what I saw. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. What exactly did you see, Dr. Volkov? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied me, his pale eyes unblinking. Have you ever wondered, he said finally, how far a mind can stretch before it snaps? How much darkness it can endure before it becomes something else? I stared at him, unsure how to respond. His words hung in the air, heavy and cryptic. I thought of Harlan's warning. Don't ask questions you don't want answered. I'm here to talk about facts, not metaphors, I said, keeping my voice steady. Let's stick to what you know. Names, programs, locations. Start with Project Nocturne. That got his attention. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether to laugh or lean forward in earnest. Ah, he said, a trace of amusement in his voice. So you already know the name. Tell me, Agent Graham, what does your government think it knows about Nocturne? Enough to know it was one of the USSR's most classified projects, I said. But we're here to fill in the gaps. Help me understand what you were doing. Volkov's expression turned somber. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. We were testing the mind's capacity for isolation. Complete darkness. Complete silence. Deprivation of every sense. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral. To what end? To see what lies beyond, he said simply. Beyond what? I asked, my frustration slipping through. He smiled faintly, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't name. Beyond the limits of humanity. By the time I left the room, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for hours. Volkov was cooperative, yes, but there was something deeply unsettling about his calm. He spoke of horrors, experiments on isolated subjects, minds pushed to breaking points, as if he were describing a weather forecast. In the debriefing, I relayed the conversation to Harland, careful to stick to the facts. He nodded curtly, his expression unreadable. Stay focused, he said. Volkov knows more than he's letting on. Keep pressing him, but don't let him rattle you. I nodded, but inwardly I wasn't so sure. Volkov wasn't just a defector. He was a man who had seen something at the edge of the map, something he couldn't or wouldn't put into words. And for the first time in my career, I wasn't sure I wanted to know what it was. Chapter 2. The Forgotten Files. I've seen my fair share of classified material, but nothing quite like the files on Project Nocturne. They arrived on my desk in a battered manila envelope marked with both Soviet insignia and the American agency's own stamps. A bilingual label on the front read partial declassification, internal use only. When I peeled back the flap, I expected the usual, a maze of redactions and sanitized summaries. Instead, what I found was something far more disturbing. The first document was a typewritten memorandum, yellowed and faded, outlining the basic premise of the project. Conducted in the late 1960s under the Soviet Ministry of Defense, Nocturne sought to explore the effects of prolonged isolation on the human psyche. Participants were locked in lightless, soundproof chambers for extended periods. No windows, no clocks, no interaction, nothing but a mattress, a toilet, and their own thoughts. Each participant was monitored via concealed cameras and microphones. The stated goal was to measure the limits of psychological endurance. But as I read on, the language grew more ambiguous. Secondary objectives include observation of emergent phenomena in sensory-deprived states. Emergent phenomena. What the hell did that mean? The second document was a handwritten log, presumably kept by one of the researchers. The entries were brief, at first, clinical and detached. Day 1. Subjects adapting to initial conditions. Some appear restless, pacing the chamber or testing boundaries. Subject 3 has attempted to dismantle the mattress. Day 2. No significant developments. Subjects exhibit frustration, evident in body language. Subject 7 has begun muttering to herself. Day 3. Audible signs of distress increasing. Subject 4 repeatedly strikes walls, hands bruised. Subject 3 stares at the camera for hours, motionless. Mutters, "It's not empty." The log went on like this, growing more erratic as the days passed. By day 5, participants were screaming intermittently, clawing at their own skin, or collapsing into catatonic silence. And then came day 7. Day 7. Subject 6 removed fingernails using teeth. Scribbled symbols on the wall using blood. Subject 3 speaks in riddles, addressing unseen entities. They wait for the quiet. They know the dark. The word sent a chill down my spine. I flipped the page, half hoping for an explanation, but the entries only became more incoherent. Researchers recorded cryptic phrases from the participants, jumbled and fragmented. One subject claimed to see shapes moving in the dark. Another begged to be let out, screaming about whispers. What struck me most was the tone of the log. The researchers' dispassionate observations began to fray, the handwriting growing sloppier, the margins filled with nervous annotations. By the end, the entries were barely legible. The next document was a summary report detailing the outcomes of the experiment. 4 participants had to be removed due to unacceptable self-harm. 3 others were unresponsive, staring blankly at the walls even after being returned to normal conditions. One subject was found dead in his chamber, an apparent suicide, though the report noted unexplained injuries inconsistent with self-inflicted trauma. The file also contained grainy black and white photographs. My hands hesitated over the first one, as though touching it would somehow make the contents worse. The image showed a man in his 20s, naked except for a pair of torn shorts. He was sitting cross-legged on the chamber floor, his body covered in shallow cuts, his hands twisted into unnatural angles. His face was turned toward the camera, but his expression didn't register as human. His mouth was frozen mid-scream, his eyes wide and bloodshot, staring past the lens as if something unimaginable had taken shape just behind the viewer. I had to look away. My stomach churned. I thumbed through the other photographs quickly, not wanting to dwell on any of them. The images were variations on the same theme: broken bodies in claustrophobic spaces, wide-eyed terror captured on film. By the time I reached the final document, my nerves were raw. It was an evaluation of Sergei Volkov himself, written by a senior official. It confirmed his role as one of the project's chief architects. The report praised his brilliance and dedication, but noted that his demeanor had shifted during the later stages of the project. Dr. Volkov's fascination with the subject's emergent behaviors has raised concerns. His insistence on pushing experiments beyond ethical boundaries suggests a dangerous fixation. Recommend reassignment or psychological evaluation. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, my thoughts racing. This wasn't just science, it was madness. They hadn't been studying the mind's resilience. They'd been systematically destroying it. But why? What could they possibly hope to learn from this? I thought about Volkov, sitting calmly across from me in the interrogation room just days before. His cryptic remarks about the edge of the map had seemed theatrical at the time, but now they felt like warnings. How far a mind can stretch before it snaps. I picked up the photograph of the screaming man again, against my better judgment. Something about his expression nagged at me, a primal horror that seemed to seep through the page. And then I saw it, the eyes. They weren't just terrified, they were haunted. The same haunted look I'd seen in Volkov's pale, unblinking stare. I slammed the file shut and shoved it back into the envelope, as if that could keep its contents from reaching me. But it was too late. The images and words were burned into my mind. I sat in the silence of my office, the world outside muffled by layers of concrete and secrecy. For the first time in my career, I felt truly alone, and I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't. Chapter 3: Sergei's Testimony. Dr. Sergei Volkov sat across the metal table, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his thin lips. He seemed at ease in the harshly lit interrogation room, as though he were the one conducting the interview. His demeanor hadn't changed since our first meeting, calm, detached, almost amused. But after reading the files on Project Nocturne, I could no longer ignore the chill that crept into the room whenever he spoke. Dr. Volkov. I began flipping through my notes. Let's talk about Subject 3. His smile widened, and for the first time, I caught a flicker of something behind his pale eyes. Amusement? Recognition? It was hard to tell, but the mention of her seemed to shift the air between us. Ah, he said softly, as though recalling an old friend. Subject 3. She was extraordinary. I waited for him to continue, but he only folded his hands and gazed at me expectantly, as if the next move was mine. I leaned forward, keeping my tone measured. The files describe her as a young woman in her 20s. Healthy, no prior history of mental illness. She began exhibiting unusual behavior on the third day of isolation. Unusual? He echoed, arching a brow. An interesting choice of words. Tell me, Agent Graham, what do you think isolation does to the mind? I ignored the question. The files mentioned singing. She sang to herself, yes? Volkov's smile returned, faint and unsettling. At first, yes, simple melodies, fragments of childhood songs. It was a natural response, an attempt to anchor herself in the darkness. But as the days passed, her voice changed. The melodies became otherworldly. Otherworldly how? He tilted his head, as though searching for the right words. Not quite gibberish, not quite language. Something in between. She began to speak to herself in tones and rhythms that were almost musical. At first, we thought it was nonsense, the mind unraveling under stress. But then we realized, he paused, leaning closer. It wasn't nonsense at all. What do you mean? I asked, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. She wasn't speaking to herself, he said simply. She was speaking to them. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Them? Volkov waved a hand dismissively, as though I'd missed the point entirely. You wouldn't understand. Not yet. Let me tell you about the discovery. He leaned back, his voice dropping to a near whisper. On the 5th day, subject 3 stopped singing. She began whispering instead, soft, fragmented phrases. The microphone struggled to pick up the words, but what we heard was consistent. Consistent how? He hesitated, his gaze unfocused, as if he were seeing something far away. She described shapes in the dark, movements, voices. At first, we dismissed it as hallucination. But the details were too precise, too vivid. She spoke of textures, cold, wet skin, eyes that didn't blink. I shivered involuntarily, but Volkov didn't seem to notice. He was lost in his own recollection, his voice growing steadier as he recounted the details. She began to change, he said. Her posture, her tone. She no longer seemed afraid. Instead, she became curious. She began asking questions, not to us, but to the darkness itself. And when she spoke, the others, those in adjacent chambers, they started repeating her words. I frowned. The others could hear her? No, Volkov said with a slow shake of his head. That's what made it so fascinating. There was no way for them to hear her. But they began speaking the same phrases, word for word, as if they were connected. My pen hovered over my notebook, though I wasn't sure what to write. His words defied logic, and yet his calm conviction made it impossible to dismiss him outright. Dr. Volkov, I said carefully, you're describing something that sounds impossible. Impossible, he murmured, as if tasting the word. You Americans are so fond of that word. And yet his eyes locked onto mine, cold and piercing. Do you really think your government hasn't tried similar experiments? Perhaps not on the same scale, but the principles, the methods, they're not so different. I stiffened. We're not here to talk about American intelligence operations. No, of course not, he said with a thin smile. But you must understand, Agent Graham, the line between observer and participant is thinner than you think. You're not so different from me. You merely wear a different flag. I leaned forward, refusing to let him derail the conversation. Let's stay focused. What happened to Subject 3? Volkov's smile faded, replaced by a shadow of something darker. On the 7th day, she stopped speaking altogether. She sat motionless for hours, her gaze fixed on the far corner of the chamber. When we reviewed the footage, we saw her lips moving, but there was no sound. We assumed the microphones had failed, but then we noticed. Noticed what? He hesitated, his hands tightening slightly. Her shadow. It didn't match her movements. When she sat still, it swayed. When she turned her head, it lagged behind, as though reluctant. I stared at him, my throat dry. You're saying her shadow moved on its own? Volkov didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. I am saying, Agent Graham, that there are places the mind was never meant to go. Subject 3 reached that place, and when she did not come back alone. The room fell silent. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. His story was absurd, yet the conviction in his voice made it feel disturbingly real. You expect me to believe this? I asked finally. Volkov's faint smile returned. It doesn't matter what you believe. It matters what you're willing to see. He leaned back, folding his hands once more. Now, if you'll excuse me, Agent Graham, I believe our time is up. But don't worry, there is more to tell. Much more. As I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that Volkov wasn't just recounting the past. He was setting the stage for something yet to come. And I wasn't sure I wanted to be around when it happened. Chapter 4. The Blackout. The files on my desk had become my entire world. Folders spread out like a map of horrors. Each document a fragment of something too vast and sinister to fully comprehend. Sergei's words echoed in my mind. There are places the mind was never meant to go. He spoke them with the certainty of a man who had gone there and returned to tell the tale, or some part of him had. That night, I stayed late in the office, poring over the reports from Project Nocturne, trying to find a thread that would make sense of it all. But the deeper I went, the less sense it made. Why had the Soviets invested so much in experiments that seemed designed to break, not study, the human mind? Why did Sergei seem so calm, so willing to share? And why did I feel like every answer brought me closer to something I didn't want to know? I glanced at the clock. 2:14 a.m. The building was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the faint creak of the walls settling. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting stark shadows over the room. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't dare stop. Something in those files was waiting to be uncovered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. It happened without warning. 1 second I was scanning a report on Subject 3, her eerie descent into silence, and the next, the lights flickered and went out. I froze, my heart pounding in the sudden darkness. The hum of the air conditioning stopped, leaving a silence so complete it felt suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak glow to illuminate the desk in front of me. The power outage wasn't entirely unusual in a building this old, but this was no ordinary blackout. The silence felt alive, as though something was pressing against my ears, muffling the world. I turned the phone's flashlight toward the door, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. But the room was empty. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the stillness. No answer. I turned back to my desk, shining the light over the papers I'd been reading. My breath caught in my throat. The files weren't how I'd left them. They'd been shuffled, rearranged, some of the pages flipped upside down. At the center of the desk was a single sheet of paper, blank except for a phrase scrawled in jagged, uneven letters. They listened in silence. I stared at the words, my pulse racing. The handwriting was unfamiliar, too erratic, almost frantic. My immediate thought was that someone had entered the room, tampered with my work, and left without a sound. But how? The office was secure, and the only key besides mine belonged to my boss, Director Harland. I grabbed my phone, intending to call security, but hesitated. What would I even tell them? That the lights went out and my papers rearranged themselves? That someone or something was toying with me? It sounded ridiculous even as I thought it. The lights flickered back on, their harsh brightness making me blink. The hum of the air conditioning returned, restoring some semblance of normalcy. But the message on the paper remained, mocking me. The next morning, I reported the incident to Harland. He listened without interrupting, his weathered face impassive as I recounted the blackout and the mysterious message. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "Graham," he said, his tone measured, "you've been working long hours on a highly sensitive case. It's not uncommon for agents in your position to experience heightened stress." "This wasn't stress," I snapped. "Someone was in my office." "Was there any evidence of a break-in?" Harland asked, raising an eyebrow. I hesitated. "No, but did security report any anomalies?" "No." Harland sighed, leaning forward. "Look, I understand this case is unusual, but you need to keep your head on straight. You're a professional. Don't let Volkov get under your skin." "That's not what this is," I insisted. "I know what I saw, and I know what I see." Harland shot back, his voice firm. "An agent who's letting his imagination run wild. Take a step back, Graham. Get some sleep. That's an order." I left his office seething, but part of me wondered if he was right. Was I letting Sergei's stories warp my perception? Had the stress of the investigation pushed me over the edge? But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, the phrase on the paper remained vivid in my mind. They listen in silence. When I saw Sergei later that day, he was as composed as ever, seated with his hands folded neatly in front of him. His pale eyes met mine, and I could swear there was a flicker of amusement in them. "You look tired, Agent Graham," he said smoothly. "Rough night." I ignored the comment, taking a seat across from him. "Let's get to it, Dr. Volkov. I want to know more about Subject 3. His smile widened, slow and deliberate. Ah, the one who spoke to the silence. Fascinating, wasn't she? You tell me, I said, keeping my tone neutral. What did she say exactly? She said many things, he replied, leaning back slightly. But I suspect you already know that. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. What's that supposed to mean? Sergei tilted his head, studying me. You've been reading the files, yes? Immersing yourself in the project's peculiarities. Tell me, Agent Graham, have you begun to notice the whispers yet? My blood ran cold. What are you talking about? His smile turned almost pitying. You think you are observing me, but the truth is, you are merely another subject in a much larger experiment. Tell me, what did you see when the lights went out? I didn't respond, but my silence only seemed to embolden him. You see, Agent Graham, the mind is a fragile thing. The more you look into the abyss, the more it looks back. And the darkness, well, it has a way of noticing those who stare too long. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. This conversation is over. Sergei leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Oh no, Agent Graham, it's only just beginning. As I left the room, his words clung to me like a shadow, and for the first time, I wondered if Harlan was right. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this. Or maybe, just maybe, Sergei was telling the truth, and I'd already stared too long. Chapter 5, Voices in the Dark. The surveillance tapes were buried deep in the archive, hidden among stacks of disintegrating reels and forgotten microfilm. I hadn't even known they existed until I stumbled across an obscure reference in one of the files. It was a single line, visual records preserved under Restricted Access Protocol C7. Restricted or not, I needed to see them. The room housing the archives was little more than a glorified basement, damp and fluorescent lit, its air heavy with the scent of mildew and dust. The attendant, an older man with a permanent scowl, grumbled as he wheeled out the box marked Noctur materials. I signed the log and carried the box to one of the nearby viewing stations. Inside were several unmarked tapes, their only identifiers a series of hand-scrawled numbers. My hands hesitated over the first one, but curiosity won out. I slipped the tape into the machine and pressed play. The screen crackled to life, showing the grainy interior of a stark, featureless chamber. A single figure sat in the center of the room. A man, stripped to his underwear, his knees pulled to his chest. His hair was matted, and his face was turned away from the camera. A timestamp flickered in the corner. Day 4, 12:47 p.m. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. The man sat motionless, his shoulders trembling. Then he began to rock back and forth, muttering under his breath. The sound was too faint to make out, so I turned up the volume. Can't stop it, too loud, too close. The words were disjointed, barely above a whisper, but there was something in his tone, something brittle, teetering on the edge of a breakdown. Suddenly, he shot to his feet, staggering toward the camera. His face filled the screen, eyes wild and bloodshot, his lips trembling as he whispered, "You can't see, but they can." My pulse quickened. He repeated the phrase, louder this time, his voice cracking. "You can't see, but they can. You can't see, but..." The feed cut to static. When the image returned, the man was back in the center of the room, but something was different. He was smiling. No, not smiling. Grinning. The next tape was even worse. The timestamp read Day 7, 9:23 p.m. The subject, a young woman, thin and pale, sat cross-legged on the floor. Her head was tilted back, her eyes closed. She was humming softly, the sound rising and falling like a lullaby. I leaned closer, straining to hear the melody, when her eyes snapped open. She turned to face the camera, her expression eerily calm. "They're here," she said. Her voice was flat and motionless. A chill ran down my spine. "Who's here?" I found myself whispering, as if she could hear me through the screen. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that built into something high-pitched and frenzied. It went on, until the sound seemed to fill the room, drowning out everything else. I scrambled to turn down the volume, my hands shaking. When the laughter stopped, she leaned forward, her face so close to the camera that her breath fogged the lens. "They don't like the light," she whispered, "but they're always watching." I hit pause, my chest heaving. The room felt colder, darker, the shadows in the corners stretching longer than they should have. I pressed the heel of my hand to my temple, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. That night, I heard the whispers for the first time. I was at home, sitting at my desk, my laptop open to a half-written report. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. I rubbed my eyes, exhausted, and reached for my coffee when I heard it. A faint, distant sound like someone murmuring just out of earshot. I froze, my hand hovering over the mug. The sound came again, a low, almost rhythmic whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable. I turned toward the living room, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The whispering stopped. For a long moment, I sat there listening to the silence. Then, just as I convinced myself it was nothing, the whispers started again, this time closer. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, and crept toward the living room. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the whole apartment was holding its breath. I flipped on the light, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. The room was empty. The whispers became a nightly occurrence. Sometimes they were faint, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. Other times, they seemed to come from right behind me, making my skin crawl. I searched the apartment from top to bottom, convinced there had to be an explanation. But there was nothing. No intruders, no hidden speakers, just the suffocating silence when the whispers stopped. By the end of the week, my nerves were shot. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed of shadows that didn't move with the light and faces grinning from the corners of the room. During our next meeting, Sergei seemed to sense my unease. "You're pale, Agent Graham," he remarked, his voice tinged with mock concern. "Not sleeping well, I take it?" I glared at him. "What did you do?" "Do?" he asked, feigning innocence. "Why, I haven't done anything. You've been the one looking into the darkness. This is your doing," I snapped. "The whispers of the shadows. You're manipulating me." He chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, Agent Graham, the mind is a delicate thing, isn't it? Once you open the door, it's hard to close it again." I slammed my hands on the table, leaning in close. "What door?" He met my gaze, his pale eyes glinting with something I couldn't name. "The one you've been staring at since you first opened those files. But don't worry." He smiled. "It only gets louder." That night, the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices. I buried my head in my hands, my pulse racing. I had to make a choice: walk away from the investigation and try to reclaim my sanity, or keep going, no matter the cost. In the end, the choice was no choice at all. The truth was out there, waiting, and despite everything, I had to know. Chapter 6, The Final Revelation. Sergei Volkov sat across the table from me, hands folded neatly, his face shadowed by the dim overhead light. He looked as calm as ever, but there was something predatory in his expression, a quiet confidence that made my skin crawl. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, until he finally spoke. "You've come to ask about the culmination," he said softly, his pale eyes fixed on me. "About what happened when the subjects broke through." I didn't respond immediately. My pen hovered over the notepad, trembling slightly. The whispers hadn't left me, not entirely. They lingered at the edges of my hearing, faint and insidious, making it impossible to focus. I'd been fighting to stay grounded, to keep my grip on reality. But here, in this room, with Sergei's gaze drilling into me, it felt like reality was slipping through my fingers. "Yes," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "Tell me what it means to break the barrier." Sergei leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a faint smile. "The barrier is not physical, Agent Graham. It is a construct of the mind, a wall that separates what we are meant to perceive from what lies beyond." "Beyond what?" I asked, trying to keep the skepticism in my tone. He tilted his head, as if considering how much to reveal. "Imagine a man locked in a dark room, devoid of sound, sight, or touch. At first, he is consumed by his own thoughts, his memories, his fears. But as the days pass, those thoughts grow quieter. The mind begins to seek other input. Hallucinations, I said. That's what happens when the brain is deprived of sensory stimuli. No, Sergei said sharply, his smile vanishing. Not hallucinations. Something else. Something shared. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That was the breakthrough. The subjects did not see random visions or hear random sounds. They described the same things, the same shapes in the darkness, the same voices whispering the same words. It was as if they had opened a door into a place none of us were meant to see. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. You're saying this wasn't just psychological? Sergei nodded slowly. Precisely. The darkness is not empty, Agent Graham. It is full, teeming with things we cannot normally perceive. The barrier shields us, protects us, but when it is broken, he spread his hands, his meaning clear. I tried to keep my composure, but my voice betrayed me. What did they see? For a moment, Sergei's gaze seemed to falter, as if he were recalling something he'd rather forget. They saw shapes moving in the dark. They described them as incomplete, fragments of forms, shifting and merging. And eyes. So many eyes. My stomach turned. And the voices? They spoke in riddles, Sergei said, his tone matter-of-fact. Warnings, perhaps? Or invitations? The subjects could not say, but their words were consistent across experiments. Even when conducted miles apart, they spoke of a presence, of something watching. I set my pen down, my hands trembling. Why continue? If it was so dangerous, why not shut it down? Sergei's smile returned, colder now. You misunderstand, Agent Graham. The experiments were terminated not because they failed, but because they succeeded. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. What does that mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sergei sighed, leaning back in his chair. The Soviet regime was not interested in discovery for its own sake. They wanted power, control, but what we found was uncontrollable. The more we pushed, the more the darkness noticed. It began to push back. He paused, his gaze locking onto mine. Do you understand what I'm saying, Agent Graham? We were no longer observing. We had become the observed. I felt a wave of nausea. You expect me to believe that the subjects, what, made contact with something? Contact, Sergei repeated, chuckling softly. Is that what you call it? Perhaps, but not the way you imagine. The barrier is not just a wall, it is a veil. When it is lifted, what lies on the other side does not simply look back. It reaches. Reaches for what? I asked, my voice cracking. For us, Sergei said simply. I pushed back from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. My thoughts were spinning, the room closing in around me. It was too much, too absurd, and yet, somewhere deep inside, I felt the weight of his words. Do you know what terrifies me most, Agent Graham? Sergei continued, his voice low. Not that we broke the barrier, not that we saw what was on the other side, but that we could not unsee it. The subjects were not insane. They were aware, and awareness is a curse. I stood, my hands shaking. This is manipulation. You're trying to unsettle me, to break my focus. Am I? Sergei said, his smile returning. Or am I simply telling you the truth? I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me cold. You've already started to hear them, haven't you? I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers, Sergei said, his tone almost gentle. They are the first sign, a reminder that the barrier is not as solid as you think. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Without another word, I walked out of the room, his laughter following me into the hallway. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the files spread across my coffee table. Sergei's words echoed in my mind, intertwining with the faint, persistent whispers I could no longer ignore. The barrier, the darkness, the presence. I reached for the light switch, my hand trembling. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, stretching toward me as I hesitated. Then, with a flick, the room was plunged into darkness, and the whispers grew louder. Chapter 7. Classified forever. The discovery came by accident. Or maybe it was inevitable, an unseen hand guiding me toward the truth. The final document was buried in an innocuous folder labeled Cross-Agency Coordination, tucked among logistics reports and budgetary requests. If I hadn't been desperate for answers, I might never have opened it. But I did. It was a memorandum from 1972, stamped with both the CIA and DARPA insignias. My eyes scanned the text, my heart pounding harder with every line. It detailed a program eerily similar to Project Nocturne, except this one was carried out on U.S. soil under the codename Operation Obsidian. The methods were identical: sensory deprivation, extreme isolation, and extended exposure to darkness. The language was clinical, but the results mirrored those from Sergei's project. Subjects describing consistent hallucinations, speaking in riddles, and succumbing to madness. One section stood out, chilling in its specificity. Emergent phenomena observed at the 96-hour mark. Subjects report indistinguishable auditory and visual stimuli consistent with shared experiences documented in previous trials. Further testing suspended due to subject fatalities and unexplained personnel disappearances. Personnel disappearance. My mouth went dry as I read the words again. The document implied that the U.S. had known about the barrier long before Sergei's defection, perhaps even before Project Nocturne. And they hadn't just observed it, they'd actively sought to breach it. I set the paper down, staring at the mess of files and photographs scattered across my desk. Sergei's warnings rang in my ears. The line between observer and participant is thinner than you think. How deep did this go? And how far had my own agency ventured into the dark? The next time I sat across from Sergei, the tension was palpable. He seemed to sense it immediately, his pale eyes narrowing as he studied me. "You've found something," he said, his voice low. I didn't bother denying it. "Operation Obsidian," I said bluntly. It wasn't just the Soviets. My government was conducting the same experiments. Sergei's lips twitched into a faint smile. The Americans, always so eager to replicate, yet so blind to consequence. "Tell me, Agent Graham, does it bring you comfort to know you are no different from us?" "It doesn't," I said, my voice hard. "But I want to know the truth. How far did this go? What are we dealing with?" His smile faded, replaced by something colder. "You're asking the wrong questions." "Then give me the right ones." I shot back, my frustration boiling over. "You talk about the barrier, the darkness, the things on the other side. What do they want? What's their purpose?" He leaned forward, his expression suddenly grave. "It's not about what they want, Agent Graham. It's about what you're willing to invite." The word sent a chill down my spine. "Invite?" Sergei nodded. "The barrier is not merely a defense. It is a test. Those who seek to breach it must accept the risk of being seen. And once you are seen," he paused, his eyes locking onto mine, "you cannot be unseen." I tried to press him further, but he only deflected, his cryptic answers raising more questions than they resolved. When the session ended, I returned to my office, my thoughts spiraling. Sergei's warnings felt less like threats and more like inevitabilities. The next day, I submitted my final report. It was meticulous, detailing the experiments, the parallels between Soviet and American programs, and the implications of Sergei's testimony. I included everything except my personal experiences. The whispers, the shadows, the sense of being watched. Those stayed locked in my mind, too fragile to put into words. Director Harland read the report in silence, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he closed the folder and pushed it aside. "This goes no further," he said flatly. I stared at him. "What?" "You heard me, Graham. This information is classified indefinitely. As far as anyone outside this room is concerned, Project Nocturne and Operation Obsidian never existed." "You're burying it," I said, disbelief creeping into my voice. Harlan met my gaze, his tone icy. "This isn't about what we know. It's about what the world can't afford to know. Some doors are better left closed." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the weight in his voice left no room for debate. I nodded, rising from my seat. As I reached the door, Harlan spoke again, his voice softer. "Take my advice, Graham. Let it go. You don't want to end up like Volkov." But Sergei's fate was already sealed. 2 days later, he vanished from custody. Officially, there was no explanation, no breach, no signs of struggle. He was simply gone, as if he'd evaporated into thin air. Unofficially, the whispers in the agency hinted at darker possibilities. Some said he'd been silenced. Others claimed he'd escaped, disappearing back into the shadows he so often spoke of. I didn't know which possibility scared me more. The finality of it all didn't hit me until I returned to my apartment that night. The files were gone, confiscated by the agency, but the memories remained. I sat in the dark, the silence around me feeling heavier than it should have. My mind replayed Sergei's words on an endless loop. "Once you are seen, you cannot be unseen." The whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. I pressed my palms to my ears, but it made no difference. They weren't coming from outside. They were inside, burrowing into my mind like parasites. I reached for the lamp on the table beside me, my hand trembling. The light was my last defense, the thin barrier between me and the encroaching darkness. But Sergei's voice stopped me cold. "It's not about what you see, but what you invite." My hand hovered over the switch, indecisive. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their words just out of reach. My breath quickened, sweat dripping down my temples. Finally, I pulled my hand back, leaving the room bathed in shadow. And in the silence, I listened. The screen cuts to black.